Remember in last week, it was on each day, at some point during that day, God sits back and says, it is good. He observes and he sees the goodness. And there's a slight pattern change at the end of day 6, after everything has been made, including human beings, is he sits back and he says, it's very good. So now it's complete, and it's gone from good to very good. Now, this morning we're going to talk a little bit about what it actually means to be made in the image of God, because that's sort of the core of what happens on day 6, at the end of day 6 anyway, is that God creates human beings, and he makes human beings in his own image. And so we're going to talk about, well, what does that actually mean to be made in the image of God? So as I was reflecting on this, I started trying to read pretty closely in the text itself to see what it might say. People have reflected on this idea of the image of God for millennia. So there's lots to say, obviously. But I wondered what the text actually said. And so I started reading really closely about some of the things that God says to people. In particular, something stuck out for me, which was this. God talks to human beings and basically says to them, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. So I've given you plants and trees and the fruit from those trees for food. And then God speaks to the beasts of the earth. So to all of the animals, God speaks to them and says, and to all the birds of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, and to everything that has the breath of life. So everything that's a living being on the earth, God speaks to them and says, I have given you every green plant for food. And so I was really dismayed this week when I read that, because I thought, what if it means that being made in the image of God means I'm supposed to be a vegan? Because there's no animals given to us for food. All the animals are, that was a joke, everybody. Like, I'm actually, I'm going to eat meat, I'm going to continue to do that, and I don't think that being made in God's image is actually anything to do with being a vegan, but it seems like the text might say that, I don't know. No, I'm going to talk about 3 core ways of understanding being made in the image of God, okay? I think we have a slide for this. We have a couple of slides today, and I apologize for, we have some technical difficulties going on with this, so everything might look a little yellow for some reason, or not at all. Maybe we don't have anything. Okay. Oh no, there we go. Actually, the yellow sticks. Look at that. Okay, we're going to talk about 3 things. They all happen to begin with R, which was an accident. I wasn't trying to do that, so that's always nice when that happens. One is we are made for rest, we are made to rule, and we are made for relationship. Okay, so we're going to talk about those 3 things. So here's the first one, and you can go to the next slide, Sheldon. You're going to have to be on the ball here. God rested, right? We get to the end of the reading today, which actually goes into Genesis 2, where it gets to the 7th day, and God rested and hallows the 7th day, creates the Sabbath day, and even God rests, which should remind us that it's okay for us to rest. A number of years ago, I took a sabbatical and had about 3 to 4 months of rest and study and a lot of downtime. And I got to the end of my sabbatical, and I know some people are really anxious when they take time off and they think, I'm ready to go back to work, and they've been thinking about that. And I got to the end of my sabbatical and I kind of thought, I think maybe I've been made for rest. Maybe I could think this is what I've been created for. This was really great. And I came back to work, and that was fine. But I started to try to build in a better pattern of resting in my work life after I took my sabbatical, because I did learn that there actually is something to that we are actually made for rest. And if you get any time where you get extended time off, you start to realize, this is good. Like, you look back like God does in the days of creation and think, this is very good. We are made partly for rest. We're made for other things as well. But God rested. God commands rest in one of the 10 commandments is take a day off. Wow. We worry sometimes about how we're sinning, and what we're falling short on. That one's pretty clear. Commandment to take a day off. So God rested, God commands a Sabbath, and then we find when Jesus comes, Jesus rested as well. He took time to go away and get away and be on his own and have some time off. So that's the first one, that we're made for rest. The second one is that we are made to rule. And so we have this. There's our ruler. She's our ruler for Canadians, right? The Queen of England. And isn't she wonderful? Everyone loves her. I love the expressions on their faces too in this image. It's great. I don't know if this is what you picture when you think of ruling, but what does it mean? In this text, it talks about God commanding us to subdue creation or to have dominion over creation, to be in charge of. And subdue is kind of a weird word for us, right? It seems very controlling, right? Like, tame it, stop it from being wild. And that kind of goes counter to what a lot of us might think. But it's really quite clear, and this is said twice. God says it to himself, that this is how we're going to make human beings, and then God says it to the human beings: be fruitful, multiply, subdue creation, have dominion. But what we want to ask is, are we picturing this? Some of us might also picture like tyrannical rulers who, like, if you're in charge, does that mean you can do whatever you want? Is that what that means? Well, tyrannical rulers might operate that way, right? But if you're in charge, it actually means a high level of responsibility. And so what we want to do is we want to look at what does it mean for us to have dominion over creation and God to have given that to us. See, God, in doing that, he's entrusting creation to us. And so we will talk about stewardship of creation, not dominion over, because our dominion is actually only a stewardship. As in, God has entrusted it to as a steward, as someone who takes care of something for someone else, right? So God's entrusted creation. Our dominion is an act of stewardship on behalf of God. God's trusting us with his prize creation to take care of it, to rule over it, because we're able to. And we've done all kinds of messing up on that, haven't we? We know that all too well. So what we want to ask is, what kind of dominion would God have us exercise over creation? And I think a way to get at this is to look at the person of Jesus. We believe that Jesus is the true image of God, that Jesus himself is God. We also talk about Jesus being king. So if anybody's the real ruler, it's Jesus. And how does he show his dominion over people and things and creation? And I'll show you, here's another image. This is how Jesus shows his dominion over. He bends down and washes the feet of his disciples, right? He calls his disciples friends. He goes to the cross and dies there for the sake of the world. That's the way God exercises dominion. And so if we're going to take a cue from God as to how we exercise our dominion over creation, and we look at Jesus and we think, well, it actually means suffering service. It means I'll make sacrifices in my life for the sake of the creation that God has given. I'll even lay down my life so that others can benefit. Wow. Imagine if we did environmentalism like that. That would really potentially change things, wouldn't it? So this is actually kind of hard to do, but if we're going to exercise dominion over creation and actually take real responsibility for it, it's actually a deeply theological concept to do that. It's not just about, make sure you recycle. This is God's creation that we are supposed to take care of for God and for one another. This is what we've been made for. This is what it means to be made in the image of God, is that we are made as someone who cares for creation and cares for people who are part of creation. All right, so that's the second one. First one, we're made for rest. The second one, we're made to rule or have dominion, to care for as a steward. The third one, made for relationship, is maybe a little bit different. And this is, I like this picture. This is why we put this on the bulletin board, because it's got two people hugging, and they've got, I don't know if you can quite see, but that's sort of a peace sign at the top there, and a heart. So it kind of spoke to me of relationship. This one's a bit harder to find in the text. God speaks, I guess, to himself at one point when he's about to create human beings. Right at the beginning of our text today, it says, then God said, let us make humankind in our image. Now, maybe he's being really like a good monarch and using the royal we. Let us do this. We shall do this, but there's only God. But some people might take this to say, well, maybe this is talking about the Trinity. Like maybe God the Father is having a conversation with God the Son and God the Holy Spirit. Let us make human beings in our image. What does it mean to be made in the image of a God that is represented as three persons who are in perfect, loving relationship with one another? Well, maybe it means that we are made in that kind of image, the image of relationship, where there's this mutual self-giving love that happens between the three persons of the Trinity. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe we're made for relationship. And as we look through the Bible, we see that all over the place, right? So Jesus' mission was to reconcile us to God, to mend the broken relationship between us and God. And in doing that, Jesus even provided a community where relationship can be built across different lines, where walls of ethnicity and socioeconomic status and gender began to be broken down, right? His followers spoke of all being one in Jesus, coming together, being in relationship with one another. Paul spoke about this, Galatians 3:28, a famous text, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. This beautiful relationship, that's what Paul's describing the church when he says that. Made for relationship across all kinds of people. Okay, so maybe made in the image of God means rest, rule, relationship. There's all kinds of other things that people have talked about around the image of God as well over the centuries. But what does it really mean? Like, what does the image of God mean on a basic level? And if we think of just the word image, we know what that is, right? Picture or art or a photograph. An image is usually a representation of the real thing, right? Or can often be that way, right? So if you're looking at a photograph of someone, like the Queen or something like that, we're not actually looking at the Queen, we're looking at a representation of the reality of the Queen, right? So that's what an image is. It's giving you a representation of the real thing. So when we think about something, when we're talking about, say, the image of God, or what the Bible sometimes calls an idol, actually, like a physical representation of the real thing that is God, the purpose of those images, when it's the image of God or an idol, is actually the worship of God through that thing, okay? So there's actually a long-standing tradition within the Christian church of worshiping using icons, which is sometimes mistaken for worshiping the actual image, worshiping the actual icon. But it's actually using that as a tool to worship God by looking at some sort of visual representation that helps you to engage with God, okay? Now, it seems like God actually isn't particularly in favor of this kind of thing. Because in Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments again, verses 4 and 5, it says, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." So it's a fine line. Can we make these images and then worship sort of through them? Well, most of the Christian tradition would say yes, that's okay. But worship them themselves? No, certainly not, right? But you can see that there's quite a lot of power in images, or what are called icons. There's a lot of power in images. And so I'll give you an illustration. I brought this is my personal Bible here. So I just want to read to you, or show you. This was given to me on June 30th, 1993, from my mom and dad with all your love on your graduation day. Okay? Isn't that nice? Okay. So, who can I give this to? I need a volunteer. Who wants to volunteer? Mary, you're a great volunteer for this. Okay, so here's, I'm out of the screen here, but that's okay. All right, here's the Gospel of John, okay? And the first few chapters. So if you can just take a bunch of the pages of the Gospel of John and just rip that out of the Bible for me. Will you do that?
Sorry.
No. Right. Good answer, Mary. Right? Did everyone? Right?
If you started to do it, what would you have done?
I'm glad you volunteered because I knew you were going to get that right. I knew you were going to get that right. Did you feel that though? Did anyone else feel that? Like, oh no, don't.
Yeah.
Why?
It's not right.
Now, if I gave her like a pamphlet from last Sunday that we recycled, she probably would have been okay with ripping it up. Right?
Yeah.
And she might not have ripped it out of like a nicer book or something like that. So it might not just be about just the Bible. But notice how powerful a symbol this is, right? We don't worship the Bible, we worship God. But notice how powerful a symbol this is, how powerful an image this is. Because is it holy? Yes. We have sacred objects, if I could have done another example, somebody come up here and take the cross and throw it down on the ground. We would have, no, you can't do that. But if I gave someone like a soccer ball and said throw that across the room, someone would have no problem doing that, right? Because we attach certain value to certain objects, right? And particularly when those become sacred value, like it's about God, that represents Jesus to us. And we see that in the sanctuary every week. So we can't do that. Now, why am I bringing that up? God said, "You shall not make for yourself an image of the form of anything in heaven or above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." What? Why does God say don't make any images for yourself? Because God has already done it. God's already made images. It's us, right? So this is the same thing, right? It's a powerful, powerful representation of the divine in each one of us. So this is why this is such an important thing to think about ourselves as created in the image of God. God has created us as images of himself. And that's the level of sacred that we should be dealing with when we look at one another. And not just one another in the church or one another in your families, but one another in your enemies, one another in the people that you wouldn't want to go near, one another in the person who's in jail right now, one another in the addict. Everyone. That's the level of sacred that we should be dealing with. God has created us as images of himself. And so we can take some lessons about that. And we can talk about how God is in some ways the model for how to live. If we're created in the image of God, God is some way the model for us. But also, we, in a lot of ways, represent God to others too, right? So there's just something about the sacredness of human life. But there's also, okay, we can learn from God, and then we can apply that to our lives and say, well, we're made for rest, we're made to rule, we're made for a relationship, let's do that well. But also when we do those things, are we being good representations of the divine of God in those things. So made for rest. When people ask you, how are you doing? Oh, I'm so busy. Oh, I'm just running around all the time. Can't take a day off. Are we living out our made in the image of God? And what does that mean to have a culture that's running around busy all the time, not really representing the image of God to one another? Or what does it mean to have a culture that if someone comes and says, I'm doing great, I'm not busy, I'm well rested, everything's good, and people would look at them like, what is wrong with you? You must not be working very, you're lazy. Well, actually, no, I'm living out my true self as the image of God who took a day off. I mean, that'd be a little weird to have that conversation, but. Or what does it mean to be living on a planet that's polluted, right? Like, if we're made to rule over creation, and we might say, okay, we're trying to do a better job of that, we're doing things, we're working on that. On the busy one, I would argue that one of the things is we think we have an illusion of control. Okay, I should have said this earlier. We have an illusion of control, as in, I can't take time off because if I take time off, things are going to fall apart. So without me in the system, everything's going to break down. So we have this illusion that we think that we are indispensable, and we think that we have to have control over whatever it is. And so I think one of the things that we need to do in overcoming that is learning to let go of control. Maybe it's okay that something falls apart. If it does, or maybe it won't fall apart. But we need to let go. With the polluted planet, maybe what we need are some better controls. Right? We need some better ways of controlling what we do and what we waste. Now, it might still be about letting go and not thinking we have so much control over things, because often our acquisition of more tends to be what's leading to waste, right? On the third one, we have broken relationships all over the place, right? It happens everywhere. And again, I would say, I think we want to control those relationships. Or at the fundamental level, we try to control people. We think, well, that person should really do what I think they should do. And they think the same about me. That's not all there is, obviously. There's all kinds of problems in broken relationships. But how much are we working to actually reconcile those broken relationships? Where are we looking at the ones in our lives where there's some brokenness in our relationships? And thinking through, how do I let go of whatever it is I'm holding on to in order for that relationship to be repaired? Or at least for me to do my part so that it could potentially lead to reconciliation. It might not even be this year. But what am I still holding on to that I need to let go of? Right, so in all these three, there's God giving us a model for how to live it out. But there's also the question of, are we actually being good representations as these sacred images that God has created? And again, last week I encouraged people in your day to look back on your day and say, what in my day can I look back on and say, oh, it was good? Much like God did in the days of creation. Well, maybe on a broader level today, in these three areas of rest, our stewardship of creation, and our relationships, what could happen this week or this month or this year where you'd be able to look back and say, it is very good. It is very good.